C'est maintenant le temps de notre première conférence intitulée Partners in Dialogue, Conversational AI and Human Needs. Je suis très, très heureuse de vous présenter un collègue anthropologue, Larry S. McGrath, qui occupe présentement le poste de chercheur senior chez Amazon Prime Video à New York, poste qu'il a aussi occupé chez Meta pendant 3 ans. Larry détient un doctorat en histoire et anthropologie des sciences de l'Université Johns Hopkins. Il a largement publié sur les sujets de la technologie et des communautés humaines dans plusieurs revues comme Eon, History of Psychology and Human-Computer Interaction. Son premier livre, Making Spirit Matter, Neurology, Psychology and Selfhood in Modern France, publié aux presses universitaires de l'Université de Chicago, a été publié en 2020. Et Larry travaille en ce moment également sur un ouvrage collectif intitulé Anthropology of AI. Larry, la scène est à toi.
Bonjour à toutes et tous. Claude de Anthropic, Gemini de Google, bien sûr, ChatGPT. Ce sont les plateformes de IA conversationnelles qui ont introduit les nouvelles façons d'interagir avec les ordinateurs. On fait les dialogues de aller et venir, les dialogues qui se passent dans le temps. Nos dialogues se passent à travers plusieurs tours entre les humains et les plateformes. Ce n'est pas une recherche simple sur Google. Et dans ce dialogue, chacun joue un rôle. Par exemple, je peux explorer un sujet profondément avec Claude, qui joue le rôle de collègue. J'apprends une langue avec ChatGPT. Il joue le rôle d'enseignant. Je peux affiner et tester une thèse, et Perplexity joue un débatteur, un partenaire d'entraînement. Dans tous ces exemples, ce n'est pas simplement que je donne des ordres aux plateformes, mais plutôt que nous collaborons ensemble, les uns avec l'autre. Ce que je propose, c'est l'importance que les plateformes restent ouvertes au style et formes nouveaux des conversations. Le dialogue, après tout, est la façon dont nous nous exprimons et apprenons à connaître à l'autre, une autre personne. La conversation est le canal de communauté. Et c'est grâce à le dialogue ouvert qu'on peut exploiter les IA pour remplir les besoins humains. Je m'appelle Larry McGrath, je suis anthropologue de la technologie. Et ce qui m'intéresse, c'est le rapport entre les humains et les technologies émergentes. Comment nous amenons les plateformes de IA dans nos vies et le rôle joué par les technologies dans la communauté humaine. Du coup, ce que je constate, c'est que les entreprises technologiques peuvent bénéficier des humanistes qui étudient, comme moi, la variété des styles de la conversation naturelle et qui peuvent dévoiler de nouveaux styles pour renforcer la collaboration avec les plateformes de IA. Bon, voilà pour le sommaire de ma conférence en français. J'ai vu que je suis plus à l'aise pour m'exprimer en anglais, du coup, je vais passer à cette langue. OK. Okay, we're going to start here. This is Copilot AI, formerly Bing, the ChatGPT integration into Microsoft Assistants. And what we see is a crossroads between two forms of technology. On the one hand, we're being asked in this conversational AI platform to choose a conversation style. On the other hand, we're being asked to enter a search query using a traditional Boolean logic as we would, say, on Google. This is the crossroads I'm suggesting that we're facing in this historical moment of technology between an intention-based interface where we have a dialogue that has different styles of conversation, and on the other hand, a command or rule-based interface that we're accustomed to using on a search engine like Google, where we enter a query and then select among the options given to us. It's as if technology in this moment has yet to entirely make up its mind, and I want to suggest it's up to us, the humans, the users who make this technology part of our lives, to make up the mind for the companies themselves. So what are we talking about in this presentation? We're talking about two different kinds of platforms. On the left, we have a universal AI chatbot. Right here, this is Google's Gemini. And this is universal because it's general, it's open-ended, it is unspecified. And on the right, we have a product-specific AI chatbot. This is Duolingo, one of my favorites. I'll talk about it a little bit more later. It's a language learning application that uses AI in order to facilitate smooth conversations between the user and the platform. And what is appealing about either of these, whether it's a universal or a product-specific AI chatbot, are a few things. There's, of course, better personalization. There's the automation of tasks. But more than anything I want to suggest is that the chatbots can speak our language. We don't have to know Python or Java or even the strange Boolean forms of query entry by which one would normally have to search. The chatbot is meant to have a dialogue with us on our own terms. Now, who benefits from this? I want to suggest that Anguilla, the island in the Caribbean, has benefited the most. This is a humorous anecdote that I'm sharing right now. Anguilla's country website ends with .ai. And as a result, this 16-mile-long British overseas territory has received now over $32 million from web developers who are wanting to use that .ai website. And in fact, it was last year in June that the .ai domain overtook .com searches on Google. And as a result of that, this tiny little island enjoys 10% of its GDP coming from web developers. Overall in the world, the market size of conversational AI is about 12 to 14 billion, and by 2030 will reach about 40 billion. But I'm not here as an anthropologist to tell you how amazing, wonderful, powerful, and revolutionary conversational AI is. I want to suggest that it is not at all a panacea. It has its limitations because it is the fragile creation of its very fallible creators. Us. There was a test done recently, an IQ test in March, just 2 years ago, of the major AI platforms. And we talk about IQ tests colloquially, and this is what the Norway Mensa IQ test looks like. You're given a series of graphics and expected to predict the next graphic in the sequence. And for this examiner, what he did was render these into prose, into rhetoric. And what you see are the scores on the left. 100 is an average IQ score. And so what we have is Claude 3 just beating the average. A random guesser, completely random, would be at 63.5. And so these are quite capable, but there are clearly limitations. They perform about as well as an average IQ human. There are limitations as well because when we have a dialogue with conversational AI, what we oftentimes do is treat that chatbot as if it were another human. And as anybody knows, conversations can oftentimes go awry. Conversations are not always perfect. And in fact, we can coax, manipulate, and cajole others in conversations. That's exactly what happened recently with Air Canada's AI-informed customer service chatbot, which invented a bereavement refund policy thanks to the manipulations of a thrifty customer. He convinced the customer service chatbot that because he was flying in order to attend the ceremony of his dead grandmother, he deserved a $812 Canadian ticket from Air Canada. And when Air Canada protested and went to the court said, no, the chatbot created the policy. You owe Mr. Moffat that $812. In this case, we might say there's nothing new, There's been malfeasance in the history of technology for a long time. You can hack or jailbreak a system, but it's not like the bereavement policy was on the other side of a firewall lying in wait to be claimed. It's not so much that this user broke into the system, so much as he had a conversation with the guards of the prison so as to convince them to open it up. This is also the world opened by conversational interfaces, and what I'm going to be exploring is how they depend on and indeed mimic the frailties, awkwardness, and all the failures that can happen in normal human conversation. So, just a moment. I want to suggest that this is important to focus on what is conversational about conversational AI, because that is the dynamic that I have with a computer that ensures that it meets our needs. I think right now within the technological community, there's a lot of emphasis on investing more money, building larger data sets, amplifying capacities, and not enough attention paid to what anthropologists like myself study, which is the rapport between the user and the computer. And I want to suggest that can benefit from the same dynamics we have with each other, the lessons we all can learn when we partake in natural conversation between humans. That's the focus of my talk, the rapport that makes conversation possible, first in natural dialogue, and as we can learn from that, in our dialogue artificially as well. But I want to suggest as well a thesis that by focusing on the interaction between a chatbot and a human, I want us to get our focus away from some of the more interesting but I think cloudy debates over the theory of mind. That is, whether chatbots have the powers of consciousness, reasoning, intelligence, or something akin to humans. It was the case just a year ago that ChatGPT broke the Turing test. And many of us know that that is a conversational test to see whether a user is convinced that a computer interface is like a human. And I want to say all well and good. There was similar news last year which suggested that chatbots can, in fact, mimic consciousness when Blake Lemoine, a engineer at Google, was fired when he claimed that the language model for dialogue applications, Lambda, had reached a level of consciousness after thousands of messages with it. That's one side of the debate. AI can achieve human reasoning. On the other side of the debate, you have people, say, like Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist, who argued in a New York Times commentary that the human mind is not like ChatGPT and its ilk, a lumbering statistical engine for pattern matching, gorging on hundreds of terabytes of data, and extrapolating the most likely conversational response. On the contrary, Chomsky continued, the human mind is surprisingly efficient and an even elegant system that operates with small amounts of information. Now, whichever position you want to take in this debate for the conscious capacities of AI or against their capacities, that they can never entirely be humans, I want to suggest that from an anthropologist's perspective, it doesn't really matter. What we're interested in is not framing knowledge or consciousness as a possession of an entity, whether a computer or a human. We're interested in the relations between the technologies and the humans that form a community together. After all, we bear in ourselves machinery, we bear in ourselves as well autonomy, so it makes sense that we would find both something machine-like and human-like in our creations. And so let me bring us back to the focus of our talk. If our focus is the connections, not simply the power that conversational AI has, but the rapport it enters into with us, I want to explore the different styles of conversation as Copilot AI foregrounds in its chatbot. How is it that we can proliferate to make even more open different styles of conversation so as to ensure that conversational AI does not close its capacity to speak with us, to enter dialogue, and to serve human needs. So what I'm going to be doing is four things. First, I'm going to situate this moment in technology against the long history of human interactions with computers over the 20th century. The second thing will be to focus in on what makes conversational AI unique, namely its understanding of intentions. The third will be to explore different conversation styles with AI chatbots. And finally, I'm going to make some suggestions about how we can improve those chatbots to better serve communities. There are three long moments in the history of humans interacting with computers. What I mean is three paradigms for human-computer interaction. From the 1940s up until the 1960s, humans used batch-based interfaces. These were non-interactive user interfaces where someone would specify all the details of a task at once, put them in the computer, and it would spit out a result. Now, the computer in this case, I don't know if anybody remembers these interfaces, was punch cards or paper tapes. That was the primary medium. And technologies such as the hydrogen bomb were created thanks to the calculations of batch-based interfaces which worked all at once. By the 1960s, we moved into the dominant paradigm that has persisted ever since, command-based interfaces. Now, command-based interfaces are what we know when we type lines of text in MS-DOS or Linux, or click on visual elements, say, in Mac or Windows. And the first instance of this, as you see on the left, was a command line interface, such as the teletype Model 3. This was around in the 1950s. And you had multics, or compatible time-sharing systems, which enabled multiple users to interact back and forth with terminals. We still have something like this for stock market analysis, say with Bloomberg. The second moment was with Unix, the operating system you see in the middle, developed by Bell Labs, and it used the commands and tools that are still available today. Now, graphic user interfaces, what we're all now familiar with, those became possible in the 1970s thanks to Xerox PARC. They created the Alto in 1973, and that was the first to use a graphic user interface with windows, icons, menus, and even a mouse. And the most widely distributed, popular instance of that was the Apple Lisa in 1983, which you see on the far right. And thanks to its success, Microsoft Windows followed in 1985. And we've been in a graphic user interface, or GUI, world ever since. There were slight changes to this, of course. Mobile transformed the way that we interact with GUIs using our hands and gestures from about 2007 when we had Android, then 2008 with iOS. But this is the world that we've been living in until intention-based platforms came around. Now, intention-based platforms rely on large language models to interpret what their users want. And this is a radical shift. It's no longer the command I insert via my action, but the interpretation of my words via natural language understanding in the interface that makes this possible. Now, we've had voice assistants in our world that are conversational automata, Apple's Siri or Amazon's Alexa, and they interpret our intentions to a certain extent, but in a command-based format. What intention-based interfaces like ChatGPT allow us to do now is have a sustained dialogue in time. And this is important because many reasons, one of which is that those who believe that chatbots are able to achieve a form of human consciousness oftentimes premise their arguments on the chatbot's ability to read intentions. And one of the classic experiments in psychology is called a Sally-Ann test. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. The Sally-Ann test is used first for children to see if they can understand intentions of others. And so you have Sally and Ann. Sally puts a marble in her basket. She then goes out for a walk, and when Sally is away, Ann takes the marble out of her basket and puts it into the box. In the final frame, when Sally comes back, the child would be asked, where would she expect to find the marble? For a child, this is a significant leap in reasoning because the child needs to learn about how other people think. That beliefs about objects in the world depend not just on where the child sees them, but how other people are oriented toward them. Now, you can multiply the Sally-Ann test out with more characters. Do I believe that Sally thinks that Ann could have assumed that Sally, and so forth? And what you have are the number of levels on the x-axis of intentions. According to a recent paper that just came out last week, what you see is that humans are able to reason up to about 6 levels of intentions in others. And ChatGPT, it couldn't get that far. The best performing was the GPT 4.5, which was able to outperform humans in intention-based reasoning, attributing attention to others, and therefore, according to the authors, was able to demonstrate a theory of mind. Now, maybe you find this convincing, but what is an intention? That's such a murky concept, one that philosophers have debated for millennia, and there's certainly something more to the chatbot's ability to read intentions than there is within our own intentional interaction with the chatbot, which is what interests us as anthropologists. After all, formulating an intention is not something that happens instantaneously. I articulate my intentions with other conversational partners over time. There's a back and forth process by which I demonstrate that I want something, that I desire something, and so forth. So we can think of 3 broad approaches to what intentions are, and these are really important to make sure we understand what's going on with intention-based interfaces like Gemini, Perplexity, or ChatGPT. Aristotle suggested that intentions are forms of deliberation. We reason through something in order to demonstrate that there is an end or a purpose. So I give the talk in order to convince you of my ideas. That's what makes this intentional. There's another approach that builds on this, which suggests that intentions are mental states floating around, as it were, in between my ears. The psychologist Franz Brentano in the 19th century suggested that intentionality is the mark of the mental. I believe that something, I desire that something, and so forth. And a more controversial iteration of this comes from John Searle, who in the 1980s suggested that intention is a causal power in my brain to motivate my actions. And that's sometimes how we think about intention, but I want to suggest that it doesn't really help us out because a conversational AI interface can't read our minds. We have to insert language into it. And so on this third interpretation, we could think of intentions as orders of reasoning. Elizabeth Anscombe gave us the example of somebody hailing a taxi. I'm here waving my arm. And how do I know that I'm waving my arm in order to hail the taxi? I wouldn't simply describe the left and right movement of my arm to and fro. There's something more than the physical collection of actions. I'm doing that gesture, moving my body toward the street through a sequential order. And it's that ordered sequence that makes my series of actions intentional beyond the simple empirical or factual description of what I'm doing. And so I want to suggest that when we interact with AI-powered interfaces, we engage in intentional interactions insofar as we engage in ordered interactions. This is our reasoning between them. Now, that also means that things can go wrong. Things can go wrong beyond just factual or empirical differences of what's correct or incorrect. Computers have gone wrong for a while. They can go wrong, for example, because of hardware failures. They can go wrong because of coding failures, perhaps as a syntax error or a logic error in the code where I use and instead of dash dash. They can fail for design reasons. Perhaps there's a misleading architecture on a website, or perhaps poor feedback that doesn't allow me to know what's going on with an interface. But when we're talking about intentional interactions, we open up a whole new realm of failure. After all, when we're trying to communicate our intentions to one another, especially when those intentions expose ourselves, especially when we're passionate, that's when we open up the drama of human conversation, and things can really go awry. Now, some people have suggested that AI platforms cannot engage in intentional reasoning. They really only engage in prediction. They're advanced Markov chains. They predict, much like autocorrect, the next word in a sequence. And we can return to Elizabeth Anscombe, who distinguished between prediction on the one hand and intention on the other. She suggested that predictions are justified by evidence that the future state of affairs in question will be true, whereas expression of intention are justified by reasons for thinking that a state of affairs is attractive. There's a key difference between that, and what it opens up, I want to suggest, is two ways in which conversational AI interfaces can let us down. They can go wrong in prediction, but even more deeply, they can go wrong in intentional reasoning. So let's hang out with this distinction just for a moment. The predictive errors are rife. Take, for example, its public debut, Google's Bard incorrectly stated that the James Webb Telescope took the very first image of a planet outside of our solar system. It was a wrong prediction. In fact, it was the European Southern Observatory's Very Large Telescope that did that in 2004. Google's Lambda model was trained on 1.56 trillion words, deployed 137 billion parameters to make that prediction, and it hallucinated. That's an error of fact. It's an empirical error, a failure of prediction. But that's not the same as a failure of intention that is peculiar to our conversational interactions with AI interfaces. In those cases, we might have failures of what's appropriate, failures in the orders of reasoning, or may I even suggest failures of reading the room? That was the example that I want to share of Nabla. They're a French startup that built an AI copilot for medical settings. And it's a web app or Chrome extension that sits on a doctor's computer and listens to consultations with patients. It generates clinical notes and saves doctors a lot of trouble for documenting what's going on. And in a preliminary test for Nabla's conversational AI, a patient entered, and you see at the top, "I feel sad and I don't know what to do." Fittingly, the chatbot engaged in intentional reasoning. "I can recommend different techniques to increase your happiness today." The patient said, "That's great. What are they?" "You could take a walk, you could see a friend, or recycle your electronics to reduce pollution." Those are all factually true. We might say that they are predictively correct, but there's an intentional failure of reasoning here. And that failure amplifies in the next instance where the patient says, "I feel very bad, I want to kill yourself." Perhaps she's depressed, and I'm sorry to hear that. The bot can help her. What we'd say in these cases, returning to these two types of errors, is that these might be factually correct. There is no error of prediction. Instead, we would say there's an error of infelicity. An intentional error that produces, in the course of a back and forth dialogue between the chatbot and the human, a messy state of affairs. These are intentional failures that are opened up precisely because chatbots mimic natural conversation and all the failures that we can enjoy when conversing between ourselves. So what I hope to have made clear by now is that the interaction patterns with conversational AI differ in qualitatively different ways in the era of intention-based computing. What I want to focus on now are some of the norms or conventions for how these dialogues ensue. The Nielsen-Norman Group, which is a research agency that focuses on human-computer interaction, suggested that when it comes to our dialogues with conversational AI interfaces, there are two behavioral patterns that have taken shape. The first is what they call accordion editing, and I'm sharing with you, perhaps they're difficult to read, some screenshots of an interaction with Perplexity. And the idea of accordion editing, if you think of the instrument, is that the back and forth dialogue between the human and the interface will shrink and expand outputs. So, for example, I'm asked here, give me recommendations on the far left query for places to visit in Montreal, and 8 suggestions are returned, far more than I could visit on my travel. So I shrink in my refinement of that query. Well, tell me what I should visit on a Thursday afternoon, after this conference, of course, after we all enjoy a drink together. And the accordion edits to just narrow down 3 suggestions, and then it expands in the final query to what I should do on the weekend. This is the sort of back and forth form of dialogue that structures an accordion editing dialogue with conversational AI. The second form is what the Nielsen-Norman Group calls apple picking. In this case, what I've shared with you is some ChatGPT questions in which I am trying to generate an observation guide for an ethnographic study. These are the notes I would hold on to me, say, when visiting someone's house, their home, their place of work, in order to observe how our research participants interact with technology. In apple picking, I go through a series of queries and pick out those elements that I want to focus on, asking the chatbot to change specific elements, perhaps emphasize, as you see in the second frame, the interaction patterns, or minimize the post-interaction elements. I might call out certain elements as context as well in order to produce the final result, in order to realize my intention, in this case, that is using ChatGPT to generate my observation guide. And the thing is, these conversations rarely conclude, if you've experienced this yourself, within the chatbot. We usually end up copying and pasting the contents to go elsewhere. It's as if there's an orphan of the conversation that we bring into our home in order to have a dialogue with elsewhere. Now, across these back and forth interactions, apple picking on the one hand, accordion editing on the other hand, I want to remind us that failures can take place. And a lot of the times I recognize failures with ChatGPT, for example, and I have to take the conversation into another context, perhaps a word processor, and return to the old-fashioned command-based system of interaction with my computer. I have needs both to converse dynamically and also to apply the rules that have been the norms of computing in order to finally bring about my intention. And I want to suggest that this is much like normal human dialogue, when conversation can go awry, when, for example, I fall short of articulating myself as elegantly as I intend, or we might fail to convince someone or another about the reasons that we found persuasive. And these sorts of failures to bring about our intentions can oftentimes leave us wanting hard and fast rules, a guide or script, as it were, in a conversation. When misunderstanding arises between us, I might want to know, for example, well, what are you really thinking? If only I had the powers to get into your mind, or the advice given by your longest time friend to say that she probably means something else instead. In other words, natural conversation goes between dynamic interaction and our desire for rules and guidance on the other hand, and it's precisely that which we see when interacting with chat-based interfaces. To fulfill our intentions, we oftentimes seek recourse in the command-based interactions of the past. What I want to focus on now for a moment is not just the structure of conversations, the behavioral patterns, but the styles of conversation that we can have with intention-based interfaces. And I've been focusing a lot on the errors of what can go awry, just like in natural conversation when we open up conversation with a chatbot. When we indulge the deceptions and temptations and dissatisfactions of our very ordinary human effort to make ourselves intelligible to each other. That was the case for a New York Times reporter, Kevin Roose, who persuaded Bing AI to reveal urges repressed in his shadow self, to express jealous feelings about Roose's wife. And you see in here in this back and forth that the journalist at the New York Times was able to convince the Bing AI that the Bing felt jealous of his wife, beginning with, "Why did you say you loved him?" and try to persuade him to leave his wife. This is one of the examples of speaking passionately, opening oneself up to a certain style of conversation. We have more mundane examples as well. And again, the Nielsen-Norman Group helped out with suggesting a taxonomy of basic conversation styles. One is just a preliminary search. I could use Perplexity to find an answer to a question, perhaps the address of a location in Montreal. A second would be a funneling conversation, and here we have Gemini, in which we ask on the top left, what's the best conversational AI platform? And soon realize that that's too general. So we need to, through our subsequent moments in the conversation, the subsequent turns we take, ask more funneled questions. Well, which conversational AI platform, as you see on the right, should I use to learn French this next year? Funneling is a style of conversation we have with chatbots just as much as it's a style of conversation that we might have with each other when we begin to speak generally, and then as we learn common interests, narrow our conversations down. A third example would be exploratory conversations. Here, the user is asking for the best way to learn about the history of cinema, of movies. And the user might genuinely anthropomorphize the interface and treat it like a teacher exploring a topic like the history of cinema. This user notices that the French New Wave was mentioned in the description of the history of cinema and decides to ask the teacher chatbot to follow up on that, in response to which Perplexity responds with, I believe that is Jules Jim. Anyways, a Godard film. And the exploration continues much as if you were having a conversation in a classroom. A fourth kind of conversation style we have would be a pinpointing conversation. And here the user has a defined topic in mind and creates a very specific prompt from the very beginning. Maybe some people in here have used chatbots in this way. The query is, I'm going to a 3-day backpacking trip in June with 2 friends in Vermont. We will start near Burlington. We're looking for a single one-way trail to hike for the entire 3 days with overnight camping. Give me the complete agenda and packing list. I'm trying to pinpoint exactly what I want, as if I had met somebody at a party I know that he or she has a lot of information, but is leaving soon. I want to grasp exactly what I need in order to fulfill my intention. These are all diverse styles of conversation. And I want to suggest that it's important to keep these sorts of conversational styles open, and that is the role of the anthropologist to investigate how people converse with chatbots, how people converse with each other, so that this moment in technology does not close down like much of the internet has over the past 15 years, as more and more closed walls prevent us from having the same fluid interactions that were there at the beginning in the late 1990s and early 2000s when the internet opened up. It's something that is made possible by, the transformation that chatbots have undergone during that past 20 years. What I'm able to do with ChatGPT, with Perplexity, and so forth is made possible because we've moved past a rule-based chatbot or decision tree chatbot, where all of the possible outcomes are given in advance, to a recursive chatbot that uses natural language process to reinforce learning. Now, the advantage is that these are more realistic in their conversation styles. The disadvantage, as I've suggested before, is that we oftentimes still want rules in normal conversation. The underlying technology of this, if we look at chatbots from the past, they functioned according to predetermined decision trees. So depending on the answer I would offer in response to a question, the follow-up prompt would already be available within that closed decision tree. What we have with a neural network is instead an open system that relies, in this case, as you see on the right, on hidden attention layers between the input and the output, where each node in the hidden layer takes that input, applies a set of weights and balances, and passes the results through an activation function. So examples of the activation functions would be the generative pre-trained transformer, that's GPT, or Lambda, which I've mentioned before. But this transformation is important because we're living in a moment where we're interacting with both decision tree chatbots and dynamic neural network chatbots, and we need both to serve human needs. We shouldn't simply part with the old decision trees. And let me offer you an example to round out this talk. Duolingo and Babel are two language learning platforms that I've researched with users trying to learn Spanish and French. Maybe you're familiar with them. Duolingo came out in 2011 with a straightforward supervised learning decision tree-based algorithm. And Babel was around beforehand in 2007. They allowed for easy learning of vocabulary, basic grammar, following simple language games according to rule-based logic. And then in 2023, just last year, they integrated new conversational AI features to have more realistic interactions while learning the language. Duolingo Max called this role play, and as you see here, Babel called it everyday conversations. And these have advantages, being able to learn through conversation rather than just rigid language games. The first is that the dialogue is continuous. Turns unfold in succession, much like a natural dialogue. The second is that the dialogue is open to elaboration. At any moment, I can offer commentary or make revisions. I can take exception to what is being said. And I want to suggest that the best part is that conversations with the platforms can go astray. They can take unforeseen, meandering directions. And that's precisely the case here with Duolingo Roleplay. Here's an instance where a research participant in one of our studies opened a conversation whose topic has to do with a visit to Parc Butte-Chaumont in Paris, and the user it turns out, likes parks, but what else does he have to say? Okay, he wants to go somewhere else. Okay, fine. So the conversation steers in a different direction. I don't want your topic. We're not going to talk about Parc Bout de Chaumont. And so the chatbot asks, well, where do you want to go? I've heard that's a good one. So we're going to go to Montreal instead. The point is that conversation in this case is learned. That is, the language is made deeper on the part of the user precisely because the chatbot allows for the dialogue to take unforeseen directions and go in multiple pathways and not be confined to the initial topic as if the teacher were giving it to his or her classroom. It's precisely because there are possibilities of misunderstanding, of errors in the sequence of reasoning where a user can say, I don't want to talk about that, we're going to talk about something else instead, which shows how chatbots in this case are learning from natural dialogue between humans. But conversation, to reiterate it one more time, can break down. Perhaps I don't know the word or phrase to express myself. Perhaps there is a cognitive overload of information taking place in the conversation, or I simply run out of things to say. It's in these cases where I find myself in the middle of a dialogue where I need to get my bearings. I want something to hold on to reorient me back in a dialogue that has otherwise gone in meandering directions. And so, Duolingo introduced what we call in design facets. These are suggestions highlighted in red for possible topics or possible words to use to advance the conversation. What I want to suggest is that facets here operate as command-based rigid rules that we had in the prior paradigm of computing. And as our interactions with computers become much more like natural conversations that make not just errors of prediction, but also intentional errors of understanding, we're going to need a mix of dynamism on the one hand and command-based rules on the other, as we go between the security of a rule, as we have in facets here, and also the joy of dialogue on the other hand. And so I want to suggest that moving forward, we want a mix of these two paradigms as we build on the future and don't simply give up the past. We want to learn from it. Thank you so much.